Thank you, Dr. Neighbors. By the way, just to let you know again, my former devotion to this president, my son, Mario, who is Wayne Anthony Ross's junior law partner now, his middle name is Lincoln. My other son, who's also a lawyer, Robert Quincy Byrd. And pardon me, I have a great admiration for Quincy Adams. I don't call him John Quincy Adams, I just say Quincy Adams. And that has maintained, especially when I'll quote Quincy Adams about how he believed in secession. As late as 1845, he was talking about it. So, in any case, here we go, ladies and gentlemen. I would like you to open up this Citizens Rule Book, which I brought up from Kenai, and if we have any extras, Mike, at the end, I'll need them. They are extremely important bits and pieces from the Constitution to the Declaration of Independence to maybe the Treaty of Paris and so forth. The thing that I want to start out with, because the premises was Abraham Lincoln a tyrant. Plato and Aristotle defined a tyrant as one who rules without law and uses extreme and cruel tactics against his own people as well as others. Let me repeat that. A tyrant, this is Aristotle, you're not too good. A tyrant is one who rules without law and uses extreme and cruel tactics against his own people as well as others. And to me, this is what we have had papered over regarding this president. I have to tell you, as Dr. Davis said, we agree. The federal government is an outlaw. It's out of control. We don't agree that this terrible war and this president had anything to do with it. That's where we don't agree. Okay. Today, or yesterday, as I was talking on one of the radio programs, I don't know if you were listening, Dr. Davis, because we both had college classes that were biting on our heels. I cited Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 of the U.S. Constitution, and how that is extremely relevant to Alaskans today. And what is the connection with the war? Okay, in 1872, 7 years after states' rights and the Constitution was destroyed by this terrible war, the Congress of the United States, which didn't care anything about constitutional restraints anymore, they passed something that most people say, what's wrong with that? It is the world's first national park, Yellowstone, 1872. There is no way Yellowstone National Park could have possibly come into existence without this terrible war. What does that have to do with Alaska? Well, if you go to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, it tells you precisely what the federal government is permitted to own. The District of Columbia, not to exceed 100 miles square, and it's one of the rarest examples where the federal government actually came in modestly underneath the bar. They took 63 square miles out of Maryland. They were entitled up to 100. And forts, arsenals, magazines, dockyards, and other needful buildings. Now, the fact that national parks are popular doesn't mean they're constitutional. So, after National Park in Yellowstone, it went over with big hits. It was a hit then, it's a hit now. Then we had Teddy Roosevelt, who gave no concern at all to the Constitution and gave us national forests. Then we had national wildlife refuges, then national monuments, then national battlefields. We can go on and on. This is why Alaska cannot control its own destiny, and why Dr. Neighbors himself, the details, I can't, it's kind of hazy right now, but he's upset that we can't even build a gravel road from one native village to another to link it up to a medical clinic. You need an act of Congress to do this. And everyone says, well, we can just, maybe persuade. I can't persuade people in Connecticut about our climate, our history, or our geography. They are totally ignorant about it. And all that those legislators want to do is pander to a green vote. And all of this comes from the fact that the 65% of Alaska is owned by the federal government, and it came about because they dared to introduce an unconstitutional bill, a national park. Again, I like national parks. Why not have an amendment? I'll tell you why. Of course it would pass. 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the legislature. Sure, I think it would pass. But it's because once they say, gee, we've got to make this legal now, that's going to set off an entire domino system of other unconstitutional, flagrantly obvious, illegal moves that the federal government has been getting away with. This is why this debate tonight is relevant for us in Alaska and really nationwide. We have to debate whether or not secession, the whole war started over secession. Now, a lot of people go, oh, it started over slavery. No, it started over secession. We have everybody's assurance over that. Lincoln would be one. So would many of his army officers. And he said this before his inauguration, at his inauguration, and after his inauguration. Now, I grant you, he changed his mind. But the problem is secession. And it is not something the South invented. So I would like all of you to turn to page 26. And we're going to do what I do when I teach constitutional studies. I can't read the whole thing word for word. I've done that, by the way, in Fairbanks and Kenai Peninsula and so forth. It takes a long time. It takes me an entire semester to go through these two documents. The first thing, you might just brush by that headline. Don't. It says, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. This is a remarkable little pamphlet because there's no font typographical error there. The word united is an adjective, not a noun. And the word states does not mean an administrative unit like Saskatchewan is for Canada. It means an independent nation. That's the first thing you need to look at. The next thing it says, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes. So let's parse through this, shall we? All right. What is natural law? Well, there is a hierarchy of law. Even liberals believe that. It's that they want their laws to be the highest regarded. Okay, so we got freedom of religion, but if you want to bake a cake for a homosexual couple, no freedom of religion for you. You're going to be arrested and fined. See? That's because case law, which should be the bottom rung of the hierarchy of law, has been elevated, and it's come right up the top. Natural law is given to you by God. It's in your heart. You know right from wrong. You don't need the 10 Commandments. But Jefferson's not talking about right or wrong amongst individuals here. He's talking about the separate and equal station to which natural law entitles these 13 states. By natural law, then, secession, this is an act of secession from the British Empire. There's no document that permits this. Well, that'll be very important as we analyze it later. There's no document that says a colony can secede. They're going to do it anyway. Why? Because they're fed up. So they are seceding, and they claim this right by natural law. Then you look at the very bottom of the Declaration of Independence, and we'll go to a lot of the citations against King George a little later. But you'll also notice in page 30, we therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, state is an independent nation, and General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. What they're saying here is God judges. We're doing this for the right motives, not for power, not for land, not for money, but let God judge us. And what will be the outcome? Whether or not we win or lose. All right? And he says, these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. States, you say. How many of you have heard that the Declaration of Independence is the birth certificate of the United States of America? No! It's the birth certificate of 13 separate nations. And as we read what he says here, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. Now, with this, sorry, Abe, the first breath of the Gettysburg Address says, 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. No! Open a trap door, drop into a crocodile pit. Imagine if Lincoln, either he's sweeping under the rug real history, or he was honest and he said, 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent 13 free and independent states. It would shatter the entire premise for this most murderous war. And the tyranny of Lincoln is never denied by any of the mainstream historians like Kenneth Stamp or James McPherson. In fact, McPherson, who I've still got his textbook from college, I don't think he's still alive, but his recent research is getting play. The standard death count has been 625,000, and it's now being ratcheted up to 700 and even 800,000. I would ask, at what point are too many deaths not worth it? Now, you have to understand what 800,000 deaths mean to a nation of 32 million people. In the per capita, it would be about 8 million today. My God, what an ocean of blood, because the man doesn't know history. And if this isn't bad enough, we'll look at his inaugural address. Unbelievable. And like a good politician, Abe knows how to talk out of both sides of his mouth. Here it comes. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, lies the momentous issue of civil war. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. Abe, don't you understand? Government and Constitution are two different things. The Confederate, it's not a civil war. It's the greatest misnomer propaganda piece you can imagine. You want a neutral term for it, the war between the states, which was coined by Alexander H. Stevens. Even that's been criticized. It's really the war for Southern independence. That's what it is. You want to take sides? The war of Yankee aggression. We don't have to call it that. The official name is called the War of the Rebellion. It is not a rebellion. A true civil war is trying to seize the machinery of government. That's what Cromwell did with Parliament. That's what Lenin did with his coup in St. Petersburg in 1917. It's what the French Revolution was about. The South wasn't trying to take over the government. They're trying to get away from it. Running like as fast as they could. Run as fast as you can. Here comes Abe. He's a bad old man. And so we have a situation here where he totally misreads. Lincoln had a dreamy belief of a union that pre-existed independence. He said, well, there were really, you've got to make union. Something like union. Oh, union. That's what you're going to be dying for. You better make it holy, I suppose. But that flies in the face of everything. But Lincoln did not act in a vacuum. The table was set for him by Andrew Jackson, for reasons of which we'll get to in a minute. He had a dreamy theory that the Union was a hallowed and sacred thing even before independence. The Articles of Confederation and the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Here's an important thing. We were perking along with the Articles of Confederation. Wow, we did some wonderful things. Defeated the world's greatest power. We got our western boundary set at Mississippi. Then we came up with the Land Ordinance of 1785 and a Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which outlawed slavery north of the Ohio River. Keep going, boys, that's good. And other things that are still part of our common law today. In 1786, some of the mid-Atlantic states, finding cumbersome trade relations, tried to get together, and they realized we just can't do this alone. We need to bring in everybody. And so they said, let's amend the Articles of Confederation. In the Articles of Confederation, you had 13 states, one state, one vote. That's it. If your state sent 3 delegates, its one vote was determined by 3-0, 2-1. If you sent 10, it was 6-4, 7-3, whatever. Got that? To pass any law, you had to have 9 states agree, and to amend that Constitution, you had to have 13. Rhode Island very wisely refused to attend the call to convention. They never attended it. Why? Because a consolidated government is what they feared, and that they would be ganged up on by larger states. A very, very wise fear. As an Alaskan, we're not a large state population-wise, have very little influence. And they ganged up on us in the Anilka Lofts in 1979. So, now what? They decided to really not try to amend the Articles. You can't do it if Rhode Island doesn't show up. So they're going to hold a new constitutional convention. And in this, they said it does not take effect until 9 states approve. Well, now the next question is, and they got 9. New Hampshire was the 9th. North Carolina, New York, Virginia, and Rhode Island, they were worried about a lot of reasonable things. But let's just, as a hypothetical, if they didn't join, without New York and Virginia, probably the new government would be stillborn. I don't know. We don't play the game of if very well in history. But suppose they didn't join. Well, the government's going to take off. Well, what's happened? Is Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island still in the Articles of Confederation? Did those 9 states then secede from the Articles? Well, by golly, I think they did. And the Articles would continue perhaps under 4 other states, which, by the way, they all approved, and Rhode Island came in kicking and screaming. But it was wafer thin in New York, 30 to 27. These are conventions. Now, conventions, that was the way to find popular sentiment, which is never possible to have a perfect expression of popular sentiment. Today we would have a referendum or what's called a plebiscite. But back then it was a convention, not a legislature. The convention process more accurately reflects public opinion. And so, now, I'm gonna throw this out right now, because there is really absolutely no refutation to what I'm about to say for the legality of secession. And here it comes. It's huge. New York and Virginia said, okay, we'll join. And there was a promise of a Bill of Rights, another thing to talk about. We'll join, but we reserve the right to withdraw if our liberties are ever threatened. And no state said, what are you doing adding this on? They all knew they had that right. They all knew it. Flip that around. Suppose somebody in that Constitutional Convention had dared to write down, no state once joining the Union may unilaterally withdraw without penalty of invasion from the federal government and the separate states. Who in the right mind would argue that the Constitution would have even had one state approve it? There's no way. So now we have the situation where Lincoln's going to make war, and he doesn't really understand history. I grant Lincoln's a genius politically, but he doesn't really understand history very well. You want to hear what Thomas Jefferson's opinion was of secession? This is his first inaugural address, and I can't read the entire thing. Trust me, I'm not taking things out of context. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. You don't want to stay in the union? The whole point of the union is that there's a mutual benefit for everybody. Patrick Henry warned at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He warned that this was going to happen. A consolidated government means a government by force and the death of liberty. The tax power will enslave our people. And watch what happened with the Whiskey Rebellion. It's totally misunderstood, as usual. Because you no longer need 9 individual states to pass a tax. All you need is just a majority of the House and a majority of the Senate. A lot easier. They wanted to grease this. It's corporate welfare. So the farmers of Western Pennsylvania can't get their corn, which they turned into whiskey, to Philadelphia. Unless they turn it into barrels, okay? The tax landed on their heads and punished them terribly. Well, it was constitutional. That we don't deny. But Patrick Henry said that once you start this type of a constitution where it's easy to pass taxes, sooner or later it's going to enslave the people. Let me read you John Quincy Adams. He did not like Texas entering the Union. And by the way, while we're at it, I'll read to you what Abe Lincoln said about Texas seceding from Mexico in 1836. Lincoln said, anybody, I'm going to see if I can find it here. I'm not going to go through all my papers, but he basically said, any people at any time possessing the power and the right to discard of the government that they are under have the right to do it. Now, Texas would not be annexed right away because it would put us on a war footing with Mexico, and it would be a disgrace before the world. We would rip out this large chunk of territory, which is rightfully Mexico's, and attack it on immediately as a state. It would be seen that the whole process was a sham, where Texas declares independence. Then can we join? It's amazing. Lincoln thought it was just fine for Texas to secede from Mexico, but he don't like it seceding from the Union. It's an important piece. Quincy Adams says, as in our opinion, the annexation of Texas would not only inevitably result in the dissolution of the Union, but fully to justify it. And we not only assert that the people of the free states ought not to submit to it, but we say with confidence that they would not submit to it. So,
2-minute warning.
2-minute warning, thank you. I want to talk about, lastly here, in the time that got left, is that Lincoln as a tyrant is a war criminal. I want to ask you, what does it mean if you turn artillery and bombard women and children in Vicksburg, in Atlanta, in Columbia? He knew it. Sherman said, we're not only fighting armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war, as well as their organized armies. I know that this recent movement of mine through Georgia has had a wonderful effect in this respect. Do you understand what it means to kill every chicken, every pig, every cow? You don't go down to a grocery store and get meat. You had it, you had poultry, you slaughtered a pig, you plucked a chicken, you shared a cow with your neighbors. When all of this is destroyed, what's the worst way to die? Crucifixion. But ask anybody what happens to the human body when it's starving to death. McPherson himself said, and it's a low estimate, that 50,000 civilians were killed in this war. And we're not talking about collateral damage where they just happened to have a bomb go off because they were too close to the battlefield. This was a deliberate policy to burn cities, to slaughter animals, and bring total war. When you look at the Declaration of Independence and the 27 things that they laid out against King George, he has dissolved our Representative House's assembly. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus and arrested Maryland legislators so they couldn't submit the case of secession to the people for convention. No trial. But the hard hand of war hit newspapers in the North who were critical of him. And it hit Clement Vallandigham, a Democratic congressman running for governor of Ohio, who was arrested by General Burnside for speaking out against Lincoln. And then Lincoln, finding him convicted by a military court in Ohio now, not Tennessee or in the front, he invented a punishment. You can't just statutorily say 5 days in jail, 5 years in jail, whatever, or death. We invented it. There is absolutely no exile, no banishment in any statute, federal or state. And Lincoln banished Clement Vallandigham to the South, which the South quickly got him back into Canada, and he came back into Ohio. That's 25 minutes. I'm out of time. I just warmed up. And so I give this now to the very scholarly Dr. Neighbors.
Clement Vallandigham deserved to be shot. He was aiding and abetting the enemy that was assaulting the life of the nation and liberty, and he was collaborating with the South on northern soil. And I would ask any of you, if you have family fighting abroad for the United States, if you knew that there were people within the borders of the United States that were aiding and abetting the enemy who your family member was risking their life to defeat, how would you feel? Clement Vallandigham, that is why I say he should have been shot, not for disagreement, but because he betrayed his country. And banishment was generous. I would also say that, Bob mentions Jefferson's first inaugural address. In that very same address, Jefferson says that the will of the majority must prevail in all cases whatsoever, while at the same time respecting the rights of the minority. The South seceded when the majority said, when the majority spoke in 1860. They seceded when Lincoln was elected President of the United States. In order to make his case, I'm glad that Bob recognizes that secession is only justified by natural right, and that is true. The natural right of secession is the substitute for the natural right of revolution, which is justified in the Declaration of Independence. But to make his case, he has to say what Southern right was violated in 1860. Did they have a right to the fruits of the election of 1860? Or did they have to abide by it? They chose not to abide by it because they didn't like the result. That is not grounds for secession. Now, he also says that the states, when the colonies separated from Great Britain, that they were independent nations qua states. Well, when Richard Henry Lee proposed the resolution to declare independence on June 11th, I believe it was, 1776, the resolution had two parts. One part was to declare independence, and the second part was to prepare a plan for a national government. They were not considered, the colonies, when they broke away from Great Britain, never considered being independent nations. And in fact, the plan of government that they did devised and ratified, duly ratified by each state, said at the heading, and I haven't looked at the book that Bob has passed out, but if the Articles of Confederation are in there, look at the very top. It says, a plan for perpetual union. They were not separate nations. No founder ever acknowledged that the states had complete sovereignty and that the plan of government, either under the Articles of Confederation or under the Constitution, was a treaty comprised of a league of separate entities. That was a sophistry that was invented by John C. Calhoun many decades later, and there were no founders who ever made that case. In fact, if you look in the South Carolina Ratifying Convention of 1788, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, in the South Carolina Ratifying Convention, rebukes one of the other delegates for daring to suggest that South Carolina had preserved her sovereignty, and he says, since the Act of Separation from Great Britain in 1776, the states compacted together into a permanent union, and he said he called that heresy. Now, South Carolina later became the home of secession. That was John C. Calhoun's home state. That's where he invented those doctrines in order to obstruct the rule of the majority, which was the natural, which flowed from natural rights doctrine. So, Bob also says something that I find curious. He says that the Articles of Confederation, the government under the Articles of Confederation was successful. That would have surprised all of the founders after 1782, when they began to consider completely changing their plan for government when the war had ended after the Battle of Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris. It was a disaster. To them, it was not working, and it was a disaster. I'll give you an example of one of the disastrous results of the government under the Articles of Confederation. In 1784, a proposal, a land ordinance, was proposed that would have abolished slavery, and not only in the territories that the United States government held at that time, but in all territories that the United States government would ever henceforth hold. A majority of the representatives in the Congress under the Articles of Confederation assented to that land ordinance. A majority of the states who were represented in the Congress assented to that land ordinance. But because of the odd rules of the Articles of Confederation that required 9 out of 13 states to consent, it allowed the minority to thwart the majority. And for that reason, alone, that brought us the Civil War and the division between slavery and freedom. Had we had the government that we live under today at that time, slavery would have been forever prohibited and restricted only to the state. It would have been prohibited in all territories that the United States gained thereafter, and would have been restricted to the old slave states alone. Now, my purpose is to vindicate the statesmanship of Abraham Lincoln. To do it justice, I have to go back to the founding and explain what happened, what went wrong. Because the government that he was defending in 1861 was the government that was established by the American founders. Lincoln always marveled that when the United States broke away from Great Britain, that they didn't just announce their separation, that they also laid down the principle of their separation. We all know the words, Bob just read them. You never grow stale from repetition, but we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And Lincoln always marveled that they included those words in the act of separation from Great Britain. And he always thought it was wonderful What those words mean is that none can rule another without another's consent. It means that no life can be scanted beneath another, nor exalted above another with justice or with divine sanction. And it means that every life, no matter what quanta of talent or imperfections, no matter how conceived, that every life is wonderfully made. That is what the Declaration of Independence meant. They established that declaration as the moral foundation for the government that they were then going to establish. There was a problem, though, that they had lately experienced in the failures of the Articles of Confederation, which was, and they also knew them from their history books, which was that small republics of the kind that Bob praises and thinks are paradise, I suppose, that they don't work. And the reason why they don't work is because in them, unjust combinations can gain a majority in them, and then proceed to oppress their fellow citizens through the normal forms of government. This was a problem known as faction, as Madison defines it. My students know this well. And the solution to it was to make the republic big. They turned all the wisdom, all the experience that they had inherited from the history of the republics, and they turned it on its head. They said that if you make the republic big, it will be difficult for an unjust combination of citizens who wish to oppress their fellow citizens from gaining control of the government. That is why they wanted to make the American Republic big. But if you make the republic big, it introduces new problems that no republic in the history of the world had ever experienced. And I want to explain that because this directly affects us today in Alaska. If 330 million people decide through their government whether or not we can build an 11-mile road from King Cove to Cold Bay, the people who are affected by that law, the 700,000 people in the state of Alaska, would participate negligibly in the decision. Which means that essentially we would not be the authors of the law that we would have to live under. If you create a big republic and live under majority rule and only have a single government, what it means is that everyone will have to live under imperial rule. The solution for that, the cause of the separation of powers, was to divide the powers between state and national government. Enumerate the powers that the national government can exercise that are properly national in character. Powers that, when exercised, affect all of us, such as the decision whether to wage war. The decision to wage war affects all 330 million of us. And so that properly belongs to a national government. The decision of whether to build an 11-mile road from King Cove to Cold Bay, that decision only affects the 700,000 people here, and therefore properly belongs to the 700,000 people who live here and are affected. This was the rationale behind the separation of powers. The separation of powers allowed the republic to be big. This is very poorly understood today. It's the hardest thing for my students to understand. But it was made necessary so that, ultimately, so that we could cure republics of their dangerous tendency to faction, for one section of the citizens to oppress another. You have to have it big, and the only way to make it big is, and to preserve self-government is to divide governing powers like this. That was their thinking. Now there's another potential problem if you make the republic big. And that is, there could be some parts of the Union that deviate from the form of government that was then being established, which is a Republican form of government. Majority rule justified and limited by natural right. So, they put a clause into the Constitution in Article 4, Section 4, that requires the national government, it requires the national government to guarantee a Republican form of government in every state. So, that way, if Alaska or some other apostate state decided to, a minority in that state had a revolution and decided to put a king in place, it was the duty of the national government to correct that, to correct that deviation from republicanism and restore rule of the people. That was your government, how it was founded. The founders inherited a landmass from the monarchy here in British North America that contained a very potent element in it that was destructive of republicanism, and that was slavery. The greatest impediment to the further establishment of republicanism in America from the founding forward was slavery. The founders knew it, they denounced it, and they not only knew that it was a standing rebuke to the moral foundation they were establishing, they also knew that it was dangerous. If you allow slavery to spread, it perverts Republican government wherever it proliferates. And so, the founders tried to put slavery on the course of ultimate extinction, as Lincoln said. And they did. They blocked its ingress from the Atlantic Ocean by abolishing the slave trade, and that, they thought, would really do the trick. They abolished slavery in all of the states where the slave-to-free ratio was low enough to facilitate abolition. In the slave-heavy states, their strategy was to open the states, the territories, to the westward, to drain off the surplus, to lower the slave-to-free ratios so that they could facilitate abolition in time. But they were all anti-slavery, down to the Catawba River, which separates North and South Carolina. They were all anti-slavery. And even the ones who held slaves, it is appropriate and historically accurate to call them slave-holding abolitionists. Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, denounced slavery. Franklin called it an atrocious debasement of human nature. Adams denounced it. Madison denounced it. They all did. Patrick Henry said he would honor the Quakers for their efforts to abolish slavery. Well, something happened. During the 1820s and 1830s, Southerners began to change. Southern statesmen began to change. The grandsons of their Republican forebears began to abandon the principles and way of government of their grandparents. And not only that, but the founders' strategy to destroy slavery, it failed. And worst of all was that this new race of Southern statesmen decided that slavery wasn't so bad at all. In fact, they praised it. They said that it was a blessing and not a curse. They denounced the Declaration, calling it folly, delusion. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, said at Savannah that the founders were fundamentally wrong. They called it a self-evident lie. Your declaration. There was a reason for this deviation from the course that their grandfathers had established. I'm going to get a little professorial on you, so forgive me. I'm going to divide the room into thirds. My students know what I'm doing. Let's say this middle part, you are one legislative district in a southern slave state, let's call it South Carolina. You two on the wings, you're another legislative district in South Carolina. And you, sir, are a representative from the legislative district here. Professor Muller, you're a representative. and you're a representative of this district over here. 3 legislative districts, 3 representatives. Here's the rub. Professor Mueller is a representative of a district in which everybody is non-slaveholders. You two are slaveholders, and everybody else in your legislative districts are slaves. Think about that for a minute and you understand the Civil War. That means that in their legislatures, when these 3 gathered, every legislative question was like 2 wolves and a lamb debating what to have for dinner. It meant that these 2 perpetually, the slaveholders had perpetual control over those southern states, over their government. They became accustomed to rule. They controlled everything within the state. Now, Bob wants to say that the southern representatives in our national government and national councils were right to oppose the tariff and oppose internal improvements, and these were unjustified constitutional uses of power. Guess what? In their own states, they were very energetic and active governments. They taxed everybody in their states, including the non-slaveholders, and then took the money and used it to pay for rich academies for the sons of the rich. They did not have a common school movement in the southern slave states. It stopped at the Mason-Dixon line. Horace Mann, the great founder of the common school movement in the North, eventually became a congressman and railed against the South for having squashed any common schooling of ordinary Americans who lived among them. The South was not white over black. It was a white oligarchy over a black and white ruled class. And that ruling class was determined to rule not only over their section, but over the nation. They knew that slavery was the basis of their power and their wealth, and they wanted to extend it all the way across the country and hopefully make it a national institution. You don't have to take my word for it, they say so. They wanted Cuba. They wanted to make Mexico a part of their slave empire. They wanted to go all the way down to Tierra del Fuego and enslave everybody and incorporate the Ladino landowners of Mexico into their interstate ruling class. That's what Abraham Lincoln fought against. Okay. Well, Lincoln's policy was a moderate one. When his party did not try to abolish slavery in the slave states, and Lincoln did not believe he had a constitutional right to do so. But what they did want to do was to prevent slavery's further spread and to restrict it. And so the major policy plank of the Republican Party, after the Republican Party formed, was to prohibit slavery from spreading any further in the territories. At that time, in 1856, when the Republican Party framed its first national platform, the United States territories were equal in size to the landmass of all the states combined. And so they knew that if you can carve out free states from all of these remaining territories, the free states will have possession of the national government, which is what the founders intended. And eventually, either by constitutional amendment or just through strong persuasion, the South would eventually abolish slavery. The war for the Union, it is true that Lincoln's constitutional justification to fight the Civil War was to preserve the Union. But it wasn't just any Union. If those Southern oligarchs successfully seceded, they would have proved to all the monarchists, all the oligarchs and aristocrats, the whole old new nobility that was watching the American revolutionaries experiment with great interest, they would have proven that the American founders in 1776 got it wrong, and that the machinery that they invented in our Constitution to better protect Republican government in 1787 was a failure. That federalism was a failure. And all Republican partisans would have to go back to the drawing board once again. Republican liberty would die. The Southern expansionist ambitions, they didn't make any bones about it. The Senator from Mississippi spoke openly about expansion. Alexander Stephens talked about reconquering Washington, D.C. and making it the capital of the Confederacy. Now, the war to preserve the Union was really, that was shorthand for preserving Republican government in all of the parts of the Union. You see, the Southern oligarchy that did rebel against republicanism, they were exploiting federalism and exploiting this new machinery that the founders in 1787 had invented in order to stabilize free government in a large republic. Now, I think it is a fact full of significance that these secessionists, again and again and again, denounce the Declaration of Independence. They denounce natural equality. They praise natural inequality. One of the delegates to the Confederate Constitutional Convention, Leonidas Spratt, even said that once we get done with securing our independence, we ought to import 40 million more human beings from Africa and put them into slavery. He said, the existing limits of the Confederacy can hold that many. It was one of the most heartless and brutal aristocracies that the world had seen up in the civilized world that they had seen. And the proof of it, the people in the North didn't quite understand how brutal it really was until the Union armies did slice through the South. And they came back with amazing stories. And you can read them in the Congressional Globe. Congressmen reading reports from Union generals coming up from the South about incredible things that they had seen that were coming to the light of day, like white slaves. Now, white slavery is as wicked as black slavery. But here's the rub. Those white slaves were the children of the plantation owners, and they sold their own children down the river. And it was immediately apparent to the armies when they came through that that's what was happening. That these parents, these fathers, had taken their own children and had sold them into plantations, in the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where the life expectancy, you weren't expected to live much over 30. That is a heartless ruling class, and it deserved to be defeated. Now, the success of the Union is why we don't remember this. And it's why our history books have a hard time recalling that the Civil War was really a war between oligarchy and republicanism. The republicanism of the American founders based on natural right, and the resurgence of what the world had forever experienced and knew all too well, which was rule of a privileged minority. They had made a comeback in America, and all the monarchs and the old nobility of Europe were watching the United States to see who would gain the ascendancy on the North American continent. In Europe, they were making a comeback. The 1848 Republican Revolution on the continent of Europe had been crushed. Several German emigres, Franz Siegel and Karl Schurz, who had fought with the German Republicans, came to the United States as refugees. Franz Lieber, too. And they joined the Union cause. An emperor was back on the throne of France, which had at one time overthrown its kings, Napoleon III. The English aristocracy was making a comeback. And all their eyes were watching who would win in America. The largest republic at that time in the world stretched from Minnesota to Maine and down to the border of Kentucky. That was it. That was the Alamo. I would submit to you that if the Union had lost that war, Hitler would have had a ready ally in the American hemisphere when that war began. This might strike you as pretty strong stuff, but I maintain it, and I'm convinced that it's right. As for Lincoln's conduct during the war, I think it was entirely respectable. I think if we, I don't know if we followed Bob's understanding of the Constitution, how this country could ever organize a defense if we were attacked, based upon his reading of the Constitution. There were something like 14,000 arrests by the Union government, by the national government during the course of the war. And Lincoln did suspend habeas corpus. But in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution explicitly grants the national government the right to suspend habeas corpus in times of rebellion or invasion. I don't know a better definition of rebellion than what happened in 1861. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus when the Congress was out of session. As soon as they came back into session, they ratified the acts that he had committed. They didn't think they needed to ratify the suspension of habeas corpus. And when there was some outcry in the next session of Congress, they did also confirm Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. And the Confederacy also suspended habeas corpus. The Confederacy also conscripted more aggressively than the Union did. And they visited bloody reprisals on their own people if they did not fight for the Confederacy. And they resisted. The poor folks, the saying, rich man's war, poor man's fight, comes from Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. 450,000 of them, both white and black, half of the Confederate Army at its full strength, fought in Union blue. There were Union regiments raised from every one of the Confederate states, except from South Carolina, because Jefferson Davis wisely sent an army down there to prevent the citizens from Greenville, Spartanburg area from rising up. There was a civil war within the rebellion. In the secession ordinances of the Confederacy, it's nothing but slavery, 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 and all of them as a justification for secession. And in the secession conventions, sometimes there were representatives of the majority poor white class who would not accept this. In Alabama, when Governor Yancey convened the secession convention there, Northern Alabamans said, no, we don't want to secede. And do you know what the Governor Yancey, who was preserving the great principle of liberty, Southern style, said to them? He said, called them traitors and said he would march the Alabama militia up to the Northern Alabama against them. And they said in reply, bring your armies up here and we will fight you. And many of them did join the Union Army afterwards. There was a Mississippi rebellion that within the Mississippi government, that were the Mississippi rebels were Unionists who fought against the traitorous Mississippi government. We lionize Robert E. Lee for having stuck with his state. Why couldn't he have stuck with his country like fellow Virginian George Thomas? West Virginia seceded from Virginia because of their loyalty to the national government. They didn't want to be part of the traitors who controlled the ruling oligarchy in the Virginia government. This was a war between republicanism and oligarchy. The measures that Lincoln took were respectable, and he saved liberty for us.
2 minutes.
And he saved it for the world as well. Trying to see what else to say. I don't think that, I do not believe when we judge Lincoln's conduct. The Constitution does not anticipate this extraordinary circumstance of massive rebellion, unjustifiable, unlawful rebellion from the duly constituted national authorities. The Constitution doesn't contemplate it. It does say in Article 1, Section 9, it mentions rebellion and the fitness of the suspension of habeas corpus. But it does say, grant the national government an awesome power if the state governments deviate from their republican form. It gives the national government the power and it commands the national government to rectify that abuse. That abuse to Republican government have been tolerated for years. And just a word more about the character of those slave state governments. The Bill of Rights ceased to exist there. The poor white class, we make fun of rednecks nowadays, and it seems to be the only class of our citizens that it's fair to make jokes about. I've stopped. I don't do that. Because that class of people were denied their American birthright for decades on purpose. They were made deliberately by policy. Education was withheld from them. They were kept poor. Their liberties were assaulted. Just not more than a month ago, I was reading the Southern Banner from 1860, and next to the column that I was reading, I read a boastful column reporting from South Carolina that a father and son had been apprehended with abolitionist literature, which under the penal code of South Carolina was deemed seditious. They were hauled into court, sentenced, and hanged. My friends, that place should not be romanticized. I'll end it there. Thank you.
Under our format now, Mr. Byrd will have 10 minutes to affirm his position. With a short summation by that after Mr. Powers, and then we will open to the floor.
Dr. Neighbors, my compliments. Talking about the tyranny of Abraham Lincoln doesn't mean I'm here tonight to talk about the tyranny of the Confederate States federal government. There's no question that they were tyrannical. He talks about an oligarchy. Oh, you know it. Imagine ripping out 1 million square miles from Mexico, what is today New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, Utah, California. A sham of a secession. California did secede from Mexico. Then General Fremont was there to pounce on it, and so as war was declared, and he got word of it. Annexing Cuba, violating our own Monroe Doctrine, which isn't international law, and has been violated up, down, left, right, here, there, back and forth all the time. Nevertheless, I'm not here to talk about the tyranny of conscription. But the last time I checked, 2 wrongs don't make a right. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, and it tells you about King George. It says he is at this time recruiting large armies of foreign mercenaries. That's right. Yeah, there were enormous regiments that couldn't speak English, mostly German. And the Irish were being recruited in the docks in Europe. Think about that. As a way to get them into the army and get passage to America, that's a scholarship that's in development, but that's an amazing thing. Because if he talks about Southerners who didn't want to fight for the Confederacy, he knows as well as all of you, I think, that there were a lot of Northerners who didn't want to fight for this war either. So scoring the Confederacy for conscription or its unjust wars of aggression against Mexico, its threats to Cuba and Spain, no argument there from me. I do want to talk about, though, this great danger of having a big government. And he talked about a big republic. This is exactly what Jefferson was addressing when he, in his first inaugural, I'll read it a little bit more. I know indeed that this is after he says, let those who wish to dissolve the Union or change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments to the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. I know indeed that some honest men fear that a republican government cannot be strong, that this government is not strong enough. But would the honest patriot in the full tide of successful experiment abandon the government which has so far kept us free and firm? So he is saying here the great danger, he doesn't want to see the government get bigger and more powerful, which of course it did. It's exactly what, if you read Patrick Henry's argument,